The wounded warrior. The battle had raged for hours, and Marcus Kane, exhausted and battered, was on the edge of collapse. His heart pounded in his chest, a rhythmic reminder of his fragility, but he fought against the crushing weight of fatigue. His breath came in ragged gasps as plasma fire exploded around him, lighting up the darkening sky. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burned metal and smoke, making his lungs burn with every inhale. He had been fighting for survival, but it seemed like everything was slipping through his fingers. As the smoke and chaos of the battlefield enveloped him, Marcus tried to stay focused. His boots, once sleek and military-grade, were now caked in the mud and ash of the ruined outpost. The defensive walls he had fought to protect now lay in ruins, their jagged edges glinting menacingly in the dim light. His stealth armor, which had once been his shield, now hung in tattered pieces, sparking intermittently from the damage inflicted by enemy fire. His leg was pinned beneath the debris of what used to be a protective barricade. Blood oozed from the gash on his side, and every movement sent sharp waves of agony through his body. The once dominant presence he carried on the battlefield now felt like a distant memory. He was barely holding on, his body screaming for rest, but his mind refused to give up. Through the haze of pain and the deafening sounds of battle, Marcus tried to push himself upright, his hand trembling as he reached for his weapon. But his arms felt heavy, his fingers numb and unresponsive, his vision blurred, and for a moment, it seemed like the world around him was fading into nothingness. His thoughts scattered, a jumble of fleeting images, broken commands, and memories of a life before the war. His world narrowed to the sharp pain in his side and the deafening roar of plasma blasts that echoed through the air. Then, through the swirling smoke, something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a mirage. Perhaps his delirium had finally caught up with him. But no, this was real. A towering figure emerged from the chaos. She moved with a grace that defied the brutality of the battlefield, her violet skin glowing softly against the gray skies, as though she were a living being made from starlight. Her presence seemed to silence the surrounding madness, drawing the eye like a beacon of strength amidst the destruction. The figure was impossibly tall, at least 12 feet, and she moved with an uncanny fluidity, cutting through the enemy's mechanical hordes as if they were nothing more than paper. Her armor, a beautifully crafted fusion of artistry and functionality, shimmered with every movement, accentuating her imposing yet elegant frame. Her midnight purple hair flowed behind her like a stream of shadows, trailing in the wind as she carved through the enemy ranks with ruthless efficiency. Her silver eyes gleamed with purpose, scanning the battlefield with a calculated precision. For a fleeting moment, Marcus's pain eased as he watched her move. She was unlike anything he had ever seen. An alien warrior, one of the Celestials, their race of towering allies who had come to humanity's aid in the fight against the Nexus Collective. In the distance, he could see the mechanical soldiers of the enemy advance, their glowing red eyes scanning the field for their next target. But they were no match for the Celestials. And then, as if drawn by some force beyond comprehension, her eyes locked onto his. In that instant, everything in Marcus's world shifted. A strange sensation, something he couldn't quite explain, surged through him. It wasn't just physical pain or fatigue. It was as though some invisible tether had connected them, a force that transcended the violence and the distance between them. He felt a profound connection, as though she could sense the very core of his being. There was no explanation for it, but there it was, an undeniable pull. "Hold on, little warrior," her voice rang out, somehow both thunderous and soothing at once. It carried across the battlefield, cutting through the noise with surprising clarity. Her tone was filled with both strength and compassion, an unexpected gentleness that reached Marcus even through the fog of his pain. "I will carry you." Before Marcus could even react, she was upon him. Her hands, large and powerful, scooped him up with an ease that belied her size. It was like being lifted by a force of nature, her strength overwhelming and tender all at once. In an instant, he was no longer a soldier on the verge of death, but a child in the arms of a protector. She held him effortlessly, her armor cooling against his burning skin, as she cradled him in her arms like he was nothing more than a fragile relic. His mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. His pride, that stubborn warrior instinct that had always pushed him to fight, flared up. He tried to protest, to insist that he was fine, that he could still fight, but the words caught in his throat. His chest heaved with pain, and he realized, for the first time, that he couldn't even lift a finger. His body had betrayed him. "I'm fine," he managed to grunt, his voice hoarse and weak. "Put me down. I can still fight." The celestial warrior looked down at him, her silver eyes gleaming with amusement. "You humans are all the same," she chuckled, the sound rich and melodic, like distant chimes. "Always ready to fight, even when you can barely stand." Marcus's pride stung, but the warmth of her laughter was oddly comforting. Despite his wounds, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace. There was something about the way she held him, something maternal, protective, and reassuring. It was as though, in her arms, he was safe. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself a brief reprieve from the chaos around him. And when he opened them again, they were moving. The celestial warrior, Nidara, carried him effortlessly through the battlefield. Her long strides covered more ground in a few seconds than Marcus could have covered in minutes. Despite her towering height, there was a grace to her movements, a fluidity that was almost otherworldly. She dodged incoming fire with ease, her every motion purposeful, while still holding him securely in her arms. It was as if she were part of the very wind that swept across the battlefield, gliding over the terrain with a quiet determination. Marcus's head rested against her armored chest, the steady rhythm of her heart providing a strange comfort. Her skin, a deep shade of violet, seemed to shimmer in the dying light of the battle, almost glowing as she moved through the smoke and fire. He had never imagined he would be in this position, not as a soldier on the front lines of a war he had been fighting for years. He had always seen himself as the protector, not the protected. But in that moment, everything was different. They reached the medical camp, and Nidara, still holding him with ease, stepped into the tent where other celestial warriors moved with purpose. The camp was a surreal blend of technology, with human and celestial medical units working in harmony. As she placed Marcus on a bed, comically small compared to her massive frame, she spoke with authority, her voice commanding yet gentle. "You stay here," she instructed, her tone softening as she looked down at him. "I'll make sure you're taken care of." Marcus, still dazed from the pain and the shock of being carried like a child, managed a weak grin. "Commander Ville won't like this," he muttered, still grappling with his pride. She smiled down at him. "Your commander will like you alive even more than he likes you on the battlefield," Nidara replied with a laugh that was both warm and knowing. "Now stay put. I'll handle the rest." As she turned to gather supplies, Marcus couldn't help but be struck by her presence. Nidara, the fierce warrior who had swept him off the battlefield with the care and gentleness of someone who understood far more than just combat, was now taking care of him. And in the strange, surreal moments that followed, Marcus began to realize that his life, his very understanding of the universe, was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The war had not only brought him to this alien world, but had introduced him to something far more complex than he had ever considered. The strength of connection, of care, and of an ally who saw him not just as a soldier, but as someone worth saving. A caregiver's touch. Marcus awoke to a strange, disorienting sense of calm. The roar of battle, the screams, and the chaos, everything seemed to have melted away, replaced by a quiet stillness that was foreign to him. He blinked a few times, his vision still blurry, before the reality of his situation began to settle in. The pain in his side had dulled into a low throb, but the aches in his body were still a constant reminder of the brutality he had just survived. He tried to move, but his limbs felt like lead, heavy and unwilling to cooperate. He grunted, attempting to sit up, but a gentle pressure on his chest stopped him. "Stay still, warrior," a voice commanded, soft yet firm. It was the voice of the celestial Nidara. For a moment, Marcus forgot where he was entirely. The softness in her voice contradicted the fierce and unyielding presence he had witnessed on the battlefield. He turned his head slowly, and there she was. She stood beside his bed, her violet skin glowing even more vibrantly in the soft lighting of the medical tent. Her silver eyes, sharp and calculating just hours before, were now soft, full of concern. Her features were even more striking up close, the angles of her face sharp, yet beautiful, with an almost ethereal grace. "How long have I been out?" Marcus croaked, his throat dry as dust. 3 days, Nidara replied, her voice rich with an accent he could not quite place. She moved with the fluidity of someone who had seen countless battles, yet there was an undeniable tenderness to her actions. She had been carefully watching over him, monitoring his condition, and her silver eyes never seemed to leave his form. Marcus shifted again, attempting to sit up, but Nidara placed a hand on his shoulder, her strength far surpassing anything a human could muster. He was surprised at how gently she handled him despite her size. "You need to rest," she insisted. "You're still healing." Despite his objections, Marcus felt the weight of her words. He hadn't realized how deep his exhaustion ran until he tried to move. His body ached, but beneath the pain, there was something else. He couldn't quite place it, something deeper, a strange sense of comfort in her presence that made him want to comply. In all his years of combat, he had never been in a position like this. A soldier who had always been on his feet, taking the fight to the enemy, now forced to lie still and depend on someone else. "You really shouldn't have picked me up like that," Marcus muttered, though his voice lacked the usual bite. "I'm not exactly light." Nidara's lips curved into a smile, one that softened her otherwise stoic features. "You humans and your pride," she teased. "Even when you're half dead, you still find ways to argue." Marcus blinked, surprised by her humor. It wasn't just the softness of her laugh that caught him off guard. It was the way she didn't treat him like a wounded soldier. To her, he was just another being in need of care, something she could help heal. "I suppose it's hard for a soldier like you to relax," Nidara continued, her voice gentle. "But you will need your strength if you are to return to the front lines." Her words struck a chord with Marcus. He had been raised to fight, to protect his comrades, and to never back down from a challenge. But now, lying in a medical tent surrounded by alien technology and the soft glow of celestial warriors working around him, the thought of returning to the battlefield felt distant. He had seen and experienced so much violence, so much loss, and now, here he was, the one whom needed protecting. Nidara seemed to read the conflict in his eyes. Her gaze softened, and she lowered herself to sit beside him. The bed creaked under her weight, but she seemed to settle carefully, her large hands lightly brushing the edges of his blanket. "You're not alone in this," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. "The Celestials don't just fight for victory. We fight to protect those who can't protect themselves." Marcus turned his head toward her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "I'm not some helpless civilian," he grumbled, trying to suppress the instinct to push her away. But he couldn't. Her presence was too grounding, too soothing. There was an undeniable warmth that radiated from her, an energy that went beyond just the physical. "No," Nidara agreed, her voice firm and steady. "You're a warrior, but even warriors need help sometimes." Marcus didn't know how to respond to that. The word seemed foreign to him, almost like a confession he wasn't ready to make. He had always prided himself on his ability to stand tall, to be the one who gave help, not the one who received it. But in the presence of Nidara, that pride felt unnecessary, even fragile. She reached out, her massive hands now gently pulling a bowl of something that smelled rich and foreign. "You need to eat," she insisted again, her tone no longer a command but a soft plea. "You cannot heal if you do not nourish yourself." Marcus hesitated for a moment, the pride in him screaming that he could feed himself, but the sheer exhaustion of his body quickly overcame that impulse. His stomach rumbled in protest, and before he could say anything else, Nidera was already lifting a spoonful of nutrient-rich broth toward his lips. He glanced at her, unsure of whether to resist or not. But then he saw the kindness in her eyes, the subtle warmth that radiated from her even in this simple gesture. With a reluctant sigh, he opened his mouth, and to his surprise, the broth was not only palatable but delicious. It was rich, a deep umami flavor he couldn't quite place, with hints of something earthy and alien. He swallowed gratefully, though his pride still gnawed at him. "This isn't half bad," he admitted, still a little disoriented from the last few days. Nidera smiled again, her expression softening as she continued feeding him. "I had it specially prepared," she said. "Celestials know the importance of proper nutrition during recovery. We've learned that over the centuries. You humans, you fight with everything you have, even when you're at your weakest." Marcus couldn't help but chuckle weakly. "We do tend to be stubborn. That's why you fascinate us," Nidera said, her silver eyes sparkling with amusement. "You don't stop. Even when the odds are against you, even when you should give up, you keep fighting. It's in your blood." Her words, although spoken with a touch of admiration, were almost too much to bear. For the first time since the battle, Marcus allowed himself to relax into the sensation of being cared for. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't pushing himself. He wasn't pretending he could do it all. And yet there was something deeply comforting about the act of surrendering to her care. In a strange way, it was a gift, a rare moment of vulnerability that he hadn't allowed himself in years. As Nidera continued to feed him, Marcus allowed himself to drift in and out of consciousness, the pain from his injuries receding further into the background. He could feel Nidara's presence beside him, a constant, steady force, like a protective shield against the storm of chaos and violence that had defined his life for so long. He wasn't sure when he had fallen asleep again, but the next time he awoke, it was to the sound of her humming softly, a soothing melody he had never heard before. It was a song of peace, of healing, and in that moment, Marcus felt that perhaps, just for a brief time, he could afford to rest. Nidara's presence had begun to fill a space in his heart he hadn't realized was empty. She wasn't just the warrior who had saved him. She was someone who had shown him that even in a world torn apart by war, there was room for compassion, for care, and for moments of unexpected tenderness. And for the first time in a long while, Marcus began to think that perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to life than the next battle. The strength of compassion. The next few days passed in a quiet haze for Marcus. He had always been used to the relentless chaos of war, the noise, the fighting, the endless cycle of adrenaline and exhaustion. But here, in the peace of the medical tent, it was different. Nidara's presence, so steady and calming, provided a stark contrast to the constant tension he had lived through. He couldn't help but find solace in her company, though the warrior in him struggled to accept that he was no longer the one in control. Each time he awoke, Nidera was there, a silent guardian by his side. Her care was consistent, unwavering. She didn't just patch up his wounds, she took the time to understand his pain, his struggle. Her touch was gentle but firm, always steady. The medical procedures she performed on him were efficient, but there was an unmistakable kindness in every movement she made. Her silver eyes never seemed to leave him, even when she was tending to her other duties. Marcus noticed that, though her face remained mostly impassive, there was a flicker of something softer behind her gaze whenever she looked at him. He tried to maintain his composure, but something about her made him feel vulnerable. Not in the way that soldiers typically saw vulnerability. No, this was different. It was a rawness, a strange opening in his chest that he had never allowed before. It was as though in her care, he was allowed to be something more than just a soldier. Nidara made him feel human again, not just a tool of war, but a person who could be cared for, who could trust. On the fourth day, Marcus awoke to the sound of distant battle drums, a reminder that the war was never far away. The quiet that had enveloped him in the tent was shattered in an instant, and the familiar weight of responsibility came crashing back. He sat up quickly, ignoring the protest of his injured body, his eyes scanning the medical tent in a panic. Nidara was by his side in a heartbeat. "Rest," she commanded, her voice steady and unyielding. "You are not ready to return to the front lines." "I can't just lie here," Marcus muttered, his chest tightening at the thought of being useless. "The enemy won't wait for me to recover." Nidara's hands were warm as they gently guided him back to the bed. "You will recover faster if you do not push yourself too soon." She spoke with the authority of someone who had seen warriors fall, who had witnessed both the brutality of battle and the necessity of patience. "You are of no use to anyone if you are dead." Marcus clenched his jaw, frustrated at being reduced to a helpless patient. He had always prided himself on being the one who kept fighting, the one who kept going when everyone else was ready to give up. But here, in Nidara's presence, the usual fire inside him was dimmed. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a wounded man in need of care, and that felt foreign to him. "I don't need your help," he grumbled, though his words were hollow. He couldn't deny the sense of safety she provided. It was the last thing he had expected from a towering alien warrior. "You have already received my help," Nidara replied, her voice softening just a touch. "It is no weakness to accept help, Marcus Kane. Strength is not only found in the ability to fight, it is also found in the courage to trust those who offer support." Her words struck him with an unexpected force. Trust. Marcus had always been a man of action, a soldier who relied on his skills and his ability to control any situation. But trusting someone else, letting someone else take charge, that was something entirely new to him. "You make it sound so easy," Marcus muttered, his voice filled with an edge of bitterness. "I'm not sure I know how to trust anyone anymore." Nidara's expression softened, and for the first time, Marcus saw a glimpse of something other than the warrior in her, a softness that transcended her formidable presence. "War has a way of hardening a soul, Marcus. It is not easy to trust when everything around you seems to fall apart. But trust is not just about others. It is about trusting yourself enough to let go and heal." The celestial warrior knelt beside him, her massive form towering over him, but her touch was delicate, like a thread of silk. She reached for his hand, gently encircling his fingers with hers. Her skin, cool to the touch, seemed to vibrate with an energy that he couldn't explain. Despite their vast differences, he, a human soldier, and she, an alien warrior, there was something about this moment that felt profoundly intimate. "I trusted you when I carried you from the battlefield," Nidara continued softly. "You didn't have to ask, and yet I did." Sometimes, trust is not a matter of words. It is an understanding that we are not alone in this fight. Her gaze never left him as she spoke, and Marcus found himself unable to look away. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the weight of the war, the exhaustion, and the constant need to survive seemed to lift, if only for a moment. He wanted to resist, wanted to push her away, but something in her presence held him in place, like a force far beyond physical strength. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you come for me? You could have left me there to die. There were other soldiers, more important ones, fighting out there. Why take the risk for someone like me?" Nidara's silver eyes glinted with something unreadable, and her voice lowered, taking on a more personal tone. "You may be a soldier, Marcus Kane, but you are more than that. The strength of a person is not just in how they fight, but in what they carry inside them. I did not come for you because of the uniform you wear or the rank you hold. I came for you because I saw something in you. I saw the will to live, the courage to keep going despite everything that has tried to break you." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. The way she spoke, with such unwavering certainty, made something inside him stir, something he had buried deep inside himself, something he had long ago given up on. "You're not just a warrior," Nidara added, her voice gentle but firm. "You are someone worth saving, someone worth knowing." Her words seemed to echo in the stillness of the tent, lingering in the air like a promise. Marcus, still struggling with the weight of her care, finally allowed himself to lean back against the pillow, his gaze lingering on her face. For the first time in days, he felt a strange peace wash over him. A sense that perhaps, just perhaps, he wasn't as alone in this war as he had believed. Nidera sat beside him, watching him with a mixture of concern and something else, a deeper understanding, perhaps. She didn't push him, didn't force him to speak, or to reveal anything he wasn't ready to. She just sat with him, in silence, her presence comforting in ways he couldn't explain. Marcus closed his eyes, allowing the quiet to fill the space around him. He didn't know how long he would stay here, in this place where the world outside seemed so distant. But for the first time, he allowed himself to rest, allowed himself to trust. And in that moment, with Nidara's unwavering presence beside him, Marcus realized that there was more to this war than just survival. It wasn't just about fighting the next battle. It was about the bonds they forged along the way, the connections that tied them together, human and celestial alike.